Deep within the English countryside, veiled by an eerie shroud of mist and shadowed by ancient trees, lay Cranbrook Asylum. Forgotten by time, yet not by memory, locals spoke of the asylum in hushed tones, their voices tinged with fear and superstition. The name itself seemed to carry a chill wind, whispering through the trees, rustling dead leaves along the dusty track that snaked towards its imposing gates. Cranbrook, a name synonymous with suffering, with madness, with things best left undisturbed. The asylum's very stones seemed to weep with the sorrow of its past, its shattered windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world it had left behind. Generations had passed since its heavy iron gates had clanged shut, consigning its inmates to a fate far worse than death. But the stories lingered. Tales whispered around flickering campfires, designed to chill the very marrow. Tales of medical experiments gone wrong, of patients driven to madness, their screams echoing through the empty corridors long after darkness had fallen. These were not mere ghost stories, but cautionary tales, warnings to those foolish enough to venture too close to the asylum's cursed grounds. Cranbrook had once been a place of hope, a sanctuary for the mentally ill. Established in the Victorian era, it was intended as a beacon of progressive treatment. But its noble intentions soon gave way to a far darker reality. Overcrowding, underfunding, and an undercurrent of something more sinister seeped into the asylum's very foundation. It became a place of despair, a living nightmare for those trapped within its walls. The asylum's dark reputation grew with each passing year. Whispers of cruel experiments conducted on patients behind locked doors, of screams that echoed through the night, silenced only by the cold hand of death. The staff, once dedicated to healing, were said to have been driven to their own forms of madness, perpetuating the cycle of suffering within the asylum's walls. By the mid-20th century, Cranbrook had become synonymous with horror. Its once grand facade crumbled and decayed, mirroring the sanity of those it housed. The government, finally acknowledging the unspeakable truth of Cranbrook, shut it down, relocating the surviving patients and sealing the asylum's fate. Or so they thought, for some wounds run too deep to be healed by time or neglect. Some places, like Cranbrook, remain tethered to the horrors they witnessed, bound by the anguish of the past, forever stained by the darkness that seeped into its very core. A darkness that awaited, hungry and patient, for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold. And the old Morris minor sputtered and coughed its way down the deserted lane, its headlights struggling to pierce the thick autumn mist. Inside, 4 teenagers, their youthful faces illuminated by the dashboard's eerie glow, bounced along the potholed road, a mixture of excitement and trepidation gripping their hearts. They were on a pilgrimage to the forbidden, a dare whispered in hushed tones after dark. Their destination, Cranbrook Asylum. It had started, as these things often do, with a dare. Liam, the self-proclaimed leader of their little group, had stumbled upon the story of Cranbrook while researching local ghost stories. The tales, each more chilling than the last, had ignited a spark of morbid curiosity within him, a spark he knew he had to share. "Come on, guys," Liam had said, leaning back in his chair, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Don't tell me you're too chicken to check it out." His words, laced with a potent cocktail of bravado and peer pressure, had the desired effect. His friends, each desperate to prove their courage, had quickly fallen into line. And so the plan was hatched. A plan to spend a night in the most haunted place in the county, a night they wouldn't soon forget. The lane seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning through a tunnel of gnarled trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, as if trying to claw at the car as it passed. The air grew colder, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thump of the engine and the nervous laughter of the teenagers, each trying to mask their growing unease. "You sure this is the right way, Liam?" Emily's voice, usually bright and cheerful, was little more than a whisper, her gaze darting nervously between the road ahead and the impenetrable darkness beyond the car windows. Liam, determined to maintain his facade of confidence, simply shrugged. "Relax, Em," he said, his voice a little too loud in the confined space. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" His words hung in the air, heavy with unintended irony. Even he, the architect of this ill-advised adventure, couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into something far more sinister than they could have imagined. As the car bumped its way along the desolate lane, the headlights flickered momentarily, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the interior. The teenagers fell silent, their earlier bravado replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. The road to Cranbrook was not one travelled lightly, and they were beginning to understand why. It was a path that led not to a destination, but to a reckoning. The car screeched to a halt, its headlights illuminating a pair of rusted iron gates, twisted and gnarled like the limbs of some ancient, malevolent beast. The gates, once imposing, now hung precariously from their hinges, as if reluctant to bar entry to the horrors that lay beyond. Above them, a wrought iron archway displayed the asylum's name, the letters twisted and overgrown with ivy, a chilling reminder of the building's sinister past. Cranbrook. The name seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. A collective shiver ran through the group, their youthful bravado crumbling in the face of the asylum's oppressive presence. Even Liam, the instigator of this nocturnal adventure, felt a tremor of fear course through him. "Well," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "here we are." His words were met with an uneasy silence. The only sound was the gentle creaking of the asylum's gates, swaying slightly in the breeze as if beckoning them closer. It was a sound that spoke of decay and abandonment, of secrets whispered in the darkness, of things best left undisturbed. For a moment no one moved. The teenagers sat in the car, their breath misting up the windows, their eyes fixed on the imposing gates ahead. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hammering of their own hearts. Then, as if propelled by some unseen force, Liam reached for the car door handle. The click as it opened echoed through the stillness, sharp and final. There was no turning back. Ah! The air hung heavy and cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The only light came from the car's headlights, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed across the overgrown grounds. Liam led the way, his flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness, followed closely by Emily, her hand clutching tightly onto his arm, her knuckles white with tension. Behind them, Chris and Sarah exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado forgotten in the face of the asylum's palpable aura of menace. The gravel crunched under their feet as they made their way towards the main entrance, each footstep seeming to echo through the stillness with unnatural clarity. The only other sound was the gentle sighing of the wind as it whistled through the gaps in the broken windows, a mournful, almost human sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I thought I heard something." Chris, trying to appear brave, shook his head dismissively. "It's just the wind, Sarah," he said, his voice betraying his own nervousness. "Relax, will you?" But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that somewhere hidden in the darkness, unseen eyes followed their every move. As they drew closer to the asylum, the whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around them like a vortex of unseen menace. They were no longer the sounds of the wind, but something altogether more sinister. Whispers of madness and despair echoing through the years, reaching out from the shadows to claim them as their own. Ah! The asylum loomed before them, a monolithic silhouette against the moonless sky. Its once grand facade was now a canvas of decay and neglect. Broken windows stared down at them like empty eye sockets, their glassless panes reflecting the faint moonlight like scattered teeth. Ivy, thick and gnarled, clawed its way up the walls, its tendrils reaching towards the roofline like grasping claws. A shiver ran down Liam's spine as he reached out a hand to push open the heavy oak doors. They groaned inwards, protesting at being disturbed after so many years of silence. The stench hit them first, a fetid, musty odour that spoke of decay, of things long dead and best left undisturbed. It was the smell of fear itself, trapped within the asylum's walls, seeping out to greet them like an unwelcome guest. Coughing, Liam waved a hand in front of his face, trying to clear the air. "God, what is that smell?" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "It smells like death," Sarah whispered back, her voice trembling, "like something died in here and never left." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. They had crossed the threshold now, stepped into the belly of the beast. Cranbrook had welcomed them into its embrace, and there was no turning back. D.E. The flashlight beams danced across the dilapidated interior, momentarily illuminating the remnants of a once grand foyer. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, hung from every corner, and dust lay heavy on the floor, undisturbed for years. A once ornate chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystal droplets now dull and lifeless, like the eyes of the dead. Liam, emboldened by a false sense of bravado, strode into the room, his flashlight beam sweeping across the peeling wallpaper and faded portraits that lined the walls. The portraits, their subjects rendered in stark black and white, seemed to follow the intruders with their eyes, their expressions a mixture of accusation and despair. "Hello!" Liam called out, his voice echoing through the cavernous space, bouncing off the high ceilings and disappearing into the darkness beyond. The only response was the whisper of the wind through the broken windows and the soft thud of dust raining down from the disturbed ceiling. "This place is creepy," Chris muttered, his voice tight with apprehension. He kept his flashlight beam trained on the floor ahead, afraid of what might be lurking in the shadows. The air hung heavy and oppressive, thick with the weight of forgotten tragedies and the palpable sense of unseen eyes watching their every move. They moved deeper into the asylum, each footstep echoing through the silent corridors. The air grew colder, the smell of decay intensifying, clinging to their clothes and hair like a shroud. The flashlight beams struggled to penetrate the oppressive darkness, revealing glimpses of padded cells, their doors hanging open like the mouths of hungry beasts, and treatment rooms, their rusted instruments still laid out as if awaiting their next victims. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she imagined she saw movement in the shadows, a fleeting glimpse of something dark and malevolent that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She kept her hand firmly clasped around Liam's arm, her knuckles white with tension, drawing comfort from his presence even as she felt a growing sense of dread. "Liam, I don't like this," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Can we go now, please?" Liam, torn between his desire to appear brave and his own growing unease, hesitated. "Just a little further," he said, trying to sound confident. "Let's see what's at the end of this corridor." But even as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling that they were not alone in this place, that something unseen was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. They reached the end of the corridor, their flashlight beams converging on a set of double doors. The paint was peeling, revealing the bare wood beneath, and a brass nameplate, tarnished with age, hung askew. Liam angled his flashlight, illuminating the inscription "Children's Ward." A chill ran down Emily's spine. The thought of children trapped in this desolate place, their laughter silenced by madness and neglect, was almost too much to bear. She could almost hear them now, their ghostly whispers echoing through the empty corridors, their tiny fingers reaching out from the darkness. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "We're not going in there." Liam, his curiosity piqued, started to protest. But before he could speak, a sound cut through the silence. A child's laughter, high-pitched and chilling, echoing from somewhere within the ward. They froze, their blood turning to ice in their veins. The laughter seemed to hang in the air, mocking them, daring them to enter. Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, clutched at Chris's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like something wants us to come in." Her words were barely audible above the pounding of their hearts. The laughter faded, leaving behind a silence more unnerving than any scream. Liam, his bravado momentarily forgotten, hesitated for a moment longer. Then, driven by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a desire to prove his courage, he reached out and pushed open the doors to the children's ward. The doors swung inwards with an ear-splitting groan, revealing a long, dimly lit room lined with small beds, their iron frames rusted and twisted with age. The air was thick with the smell of stale disinfectant and something else, something acrid and unsettling, like the scent of burnt flesh. Toys lay scattered across the floor, their once bright colours faded to a dull grey, their plastic faces frozen in grotesque smiles. In the centre of the room, a single desk stood illuminated by a stray beam of moonlight. An old doctor's bag lay open on the desk, its contents spilling out onto the dusty surface needles, vials of unknown liquids, and a heavy leather-bound book. "What is this place?" Chris whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of their own breathing. He edged closer to the desk, drawn by a morbid fascination. As he reached out to touch the book, a cold draught seemed to sweep through the room, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging them into darkness.
Oh! Panic surged through the group as darkness enveloped them. The flashlight beams, once their only source of comfort, were gone, leaving them blind and vulnerable in the heart of the asylum. Liam. Emily? Where are you? Sarah's voice, shrill with terror, cut through the darkness. Her words were met with silence, a silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She fumbled for Chris's hand, her fingers closing around empty air. "Chris? Chris, where are you?" she cried, her voice rising in panic. She stumbled backwards, her foot catching on something on the floor. She cried out as she fell, her hand connecting with something cold and hard. It was a doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained, its glassy eyes staring up at her with an unnervingly lifelike intensity. A scream rose in her throat, a silent scream that died in her chest, choked by the suffocating darkness and the overwhelming terror that threatened to consume her. She was alone in the darkness, surrounded by unseen horrors, and the only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart.
A blood-curdling scream shattered the oppressive silence, echoing through the desolate halls of Cranbrook. Sarah's scream. It jolted the others back to a horrifying reality, their own terror amplified by the echoing cry that seemed to claw its way out of the very walls themselves. Liam, his heart pounding in his chest, fumbled for his flashlight, his fingers trembling as he desperately clicked the switch. The beam flickered to life, casting a pale, unsteady circle in the suffocating darkness. "Sarah! Sarah, where are you?" Liam's voice, hoarse with fear, cut through the darkness, his words swallowed by the cavernous space. He strained to hear a response, any sign of his friend, but the only sound was the frantic thump of his own heart. The air, thick with the stench of decay and the lingering echo of Sarah's scream, seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a malevolent presence that sent shivers down his spine. The flashlight beam landed on Sarah, illuminating her crumpled form on the floor. She lay amidst the scattered toys, her eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her hand, still clutching the cracked porcelain doll, was as white as bone, her knuckles stark against the doll's disturbingly lifelike face. "Sarah, are you all right?" Emily rushed to her friend's side, her own voice trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. She knelt beside Sarah, gently prying the doll from her grasp and tossing it aside. It landed with a dull thud on the floor, its painted eyes seeming to follow their every move. As Sarah struggled to catch her breath, her panicked gasps echoing in the oppressive silence, her panicked gasps echoing in the oppressive silence, Liam noticed something move in the periphery of his vision. A flicker of shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, detached itself from the wall and slithered towards them, its form shifting and writhing like smoke in a breeze. What was that? Chris's voice was tight with apprehension, his gaze darting nervously around the room. He instinctively stepped back, bumping into the desk and sending a shiver down their spines as the old doctor's bag tumbled to the floor, spilling its contents with a clatter. Liam swung the flashlight beam towards the movement, his heart pounding against his ribs. The shadows, disturbed by the sudden intrusion of light, recoiled momentarily, their forms twisting and contorting before resolving into the shape of a tall, gaunt figure. It stood at the edge of the flashlight beam, its features obscured by darkness, its eyes two glowing embers that seemed to burn into their souls. A wave of icy fear washed over them, the air growing heavy with a palpable sense of menace. The figure remained motionless, its silence more unnerving than any scream. They were frozen in its gaze, paralyzed by a primal fear that seemed to seep into their very bones. They were no longer alone in the asylum. "Run!" Liam shouted, breaking the spell that held them captive. He didn't need to tell them twice. The sight of the shadowy figure, its eyes burning with an unholy light, was enough to unleash the primal instinct for survival that lay dormant within them. They scrambled to their feet, adrenaline coursing through their veins, and fled blindly into the darkness, their fear propelling them forward. They stumbled over unseen obstacles, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed around them. The sound of their own panicked breaths echoed in their ears, their footsteps pounding a frantic rhythm against the asylum's cold, unforgiving floors. But above it all, they could hear the echo of the shadowy figure in pursuit, its heavy tread relentless, its presence growing stronger with every passing moment. Emily, her chest constricted with fear, risked a glance over her shoulder. The shadowy figure was gaining on them, its form shifting and distorting as it moved, its glowing eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made her blood run cold. They had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that had been lying dormant within the asylum's walls, waiting for unsuspecting souls to awaken it from its slumber. They burst out of the children's ward, their lungs burning, their legs screaming for respite. But the asylum offered no sanctuary, only a labyrinth of twisting corridors and decaying rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The air grew colder, the stench of decay intensifying, clinging to them like a shroud. They could hear the shadowy figure closing in, its heavy tread echoing through the corridors, its presence growing stronger with every passing moment. They were running out of time, and their escape routes seemed to be closing in on them with every turn. "This way!" Liam cried, his voice hoarse with exertion and fear. He veered sharply to the left, leading them down a narrow corridor that opened into a large, cavernous room. It had once been a common area, but now it was a scene of utter chaos. Furniture lay overturned, papers were scattered across the floor, and a grand piano sat silent and forlorn in the corner, its keys coated in dust. The room offered no obvious escape, only more darkness and the chilling certainty that they were being herded, like prey caught in a trap. They were running out of options, their hope dwindling with every passing moment. Section 5. No way out. The shadowy figure emerged from the corridor, its form solidifying as it approached, its features becoming clearer in the flickering flashlight beams. It was a tall, skeletal figure, its clothes tattered and decayed, its skin stretched taut over its bones like parchment. Its eyes, burning with an unholy light, seemed to pierce through them, reflecting their own terror back at them with chilling clarity. They were trapped, with nowhere left to run. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in, the air thick with the stench of decay and the palpable weight of their own fear. Sarah sank to her knees, her eyes wide with terror, her voice a strangled whisper. "We're going to die," she whimpered, her voice barely audible above the frantic pounding of their hearts. "We're all going to die here." Liam, his back against the wall, felt a surge of protectiveness towards his friends, even as his own fear threatened to consume him. "No, we're not," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "We're going to get out of here. We're going to—" His words were cut short as the shadowy figure lunged towards them, its skeletal hand reaching out, its touch promising unimaginable pain and eternal darkness. Section 1. The Price of Fear. Time seemed to distort, stretching into an eternity as the shadowy figure lunged. Liam shoved Emily aside, a desperate act of protection as the skeletal hand swiped through the space where she had been standing just moments before. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a cold dread that seemed to claw at their sanity. The figure turned its burning gaze on Liam, and a chilling laughter devoid of humour echoed through the room. "Liam, look out!" Chris's warning was lost in the cacophony of their terror. The bag of medical instruments lay forgotten at their feet, a vial of shimmering liquid catching the flashlight beam as it rolled. It was a moment of desperate inspiration, born of sheer terror. Liam lunged for the vial, his fingers closing around the cold glass. He hurled it towards the figure with all his remaining strength, his heart pounding in his chest. The vial shattered against the wall behind the figure, the liquid splattering across the stone like blood against a snowdrift. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadowy figure remained frozen, its skeletal hand outstretched, its glowing eyes fixed on Liam. Then a low moan, filled with pain and rage, echoed through the room. The figure staggered back, its form flickering and distorting as if consumed by an invisible fire. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and something else, something ancient and foul, like the breath of a long-dead god. Section 2. Whispers of Madness. Panic threatened to consume them as the shadowy figure writhed and moaned, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, scrambled backwards, her hand connecting with something cold and hard. It was the grand piano, its once polished surface now dull and dusty. Her fingers brushed against the keys, and a discordant jangle filled the air, a jarring counterpoint to the figure's tortured cries. The sound seemed to amplify the figure's agony. It roared in pain and fury, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the asylum. The shadows around them deepened, swirling and twisting as if alive, and the air grew heavy with a suffocating dread. Whispers began to fill Emily's mind, insidious whispers that slithered through the darkness, worming their way into her thoughts. They spoke of despair and madness, of things best left forgotten, of the asylum's hunger for souls. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the voices, but they clung to her with the tenacity of a spider web, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Emily, are you okay?" Liam's voice, strained and distant, cut through the fog of fear that threatened to engulf her. She looked at him, his face pale and drawn in the flickering flashlight beam, and saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. The whispers were affecting them all, chipping away at their sanity, their grip on reality. Ye. Intim. Section 3. The Asylum's Grip. The shadowy figure was changing, its form becoming more defined, more human. The tattered clothes it wore solidified into a doctor's coat, stained and torn with age. The skeletal hand, still reaching out towards them, began to take on the semblance of flesh and bone. But the eyes, those burning embers of unholy light, remained the same, fixed on them with a chilling intensity. The whispers intensified, their voices growing louder, more insistent. They spoke of secrets hidden within the asylum's walls, of horrors witnessed and endured, of the darkness that claimed those foolish enough to venture within its grasp. The whispers were no longer confined to Emily's mind. They seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, from the shadows that danced and writhed around them, from the air they breathed. The air grew colder, the stench of decay overwhelming. The floor beneath their feet seemed to shift and sway, as if the asylum itself were alive, its foundations groaning under the weight of its own malevolence. They were no longer merely trapped within the asylum, they were being consumed by it, their fear and despair feeding its insatiable hunger. Liam whispered, "We have to get out of here." He looked at his friends, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something cold and distant, as if the asylum were already claiming them for its own. Section 4. A glimmer of hope. The discordant jangle of the piano keys, struck again by Sarah in her terror, seemed to momentarily distract the figure. The whispers receded, their insidious voices fading into the background noise of their own fear. Liam saw his chance, a sliver of hope in the heart of darkness. He shouted, "The window!" pointing towards a large arched window at the far end of the room. It was boarded up, but the wood was old and rotten, weakened by years of neglect. It might be their only way out. Chris, his eyes flickering between the window and the figure, which was slowly turning towards them, its attention drawn back to its prey, nodded curtly. "I'll get it open," he said, his voice tight with determination. He grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table, its silver tarnished but still solid, and charged towards the window, adrenaline lending him strength. Emily cried, "Chris, wait!" her voice filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. But Chris was already swinging the candlestick, the metal connecting with the wood with a satisfying thud. Section 5. The chase resumes. The first board splintered and cracked, sending a cascade of dust and rotten wood tumbling to the floor. Chris, his breath misting in the cold air, swung again, his muscles burning with exertion. Each strike of the candlestick was a blow against the asylum's hold on them, a desperate attempt to carve their way out of the nightmare. The shadowy figure, its attention now fully focused on their escape, let out a roar of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the asylum. It lunged towards Chris, its skeletal hand reaching out, its touch promising unimaginable pain and eternal darkness. Sarah screamed, "Liam, help him!" her voice raw with terror. Liam didn't hesitate. He grabbed an overturned chair and hurled it at the figure, the wood splintering against its side. The figure stumbled, momentarily distracted, giving Chris precious seconds to continue his assault on the window. He could feel the wood giving way, could see a sliver of moonlight shining through the widening gap. They were so close, tantalizingly close, to escaping the clutches of Cranbrook. But the asylum, like a predator sensing its prey escaping, was not about to relinquish its grasp so easily. Easy door. Another board splintered, then another, and finally, with a groan of surrender, the last barrier gave way. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of decay within the asylum. The moonlight streamed through the opening, illuminating the desperate struggle in its stark, unforgiving light. Chris, his hands scraped and bleeding, tossed the candlestick aside and grabbed the edges of the window frame, his muscles screaming in protest. He heaved himself up, his legs dangling into the night, his eyes searching for a handhold on the crumbling stone facade. But it was too late. The shadowy figure, with a speed that belied its skeletal form, was upon him. The skeletal hand shot out, its grip closing around Chris's ankle with bone-chilling strength. Chris cried out in pain, his body jolted back, his grip on the window frame slipping. Liam, his heart pounding in his chest, lunged forward, his hand outstretched. He grabbed Chris's arm, his fingers digging into flesh, holding on with a strength born of desperation. Their eyes met, Chris's wide with terror, Liam's filled with a fierce determination. He would not let go. He would not let Cranbrook claim another victim. Wow. "Emily, Sarah, help me," Liam roared, his voice strained with exertion. Emily and Sarah, their initial paralysis overcome by the urgency of the moment, sprang into action. They grabbed onto Liam's waist, forming a human chain, their combined weight pulling against the shadowy figure's grip. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet, threatening to give way and send them plunging into the darkness below. For a moment, it was a stalemate. Liam could feel the figure's grip tightening on Chris's ankle, the icy touch burning through his friend's flesh. Chris's screams echoed in the night, a chilling counterpoint to the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. And then, as quickly as it had grasped Chris, the skeletal hand released its grip. The shadowy figure staggered back, its form flickering and distorting as a wave of invisible energy seemed to ripple through the room. The whispers, which had reached a fever pitch, abruptly ceased, leaving behind a silence that was more unnerving than any scream. Section 3. A haunting silence. Liam didn't hesitate. He pulled with all his might, his muscles screaming in protest, and finally Chris tumbled through the window and into their waiting arms. They collapsed onto the cold, hard ground, a tangle of limbs and ragged breaths, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. They scrambled away from the asylum, their eyes fixed on the gaping maw of the window, their breath misting in the cold night air. The silence from within was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breaths and the frantic thumping of their hearts. Did we make it? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with shock. Liam, still catching his breath, looked at his friends, their faces pale and drawn in the moonlight. Chris lay on the ground, his ankle twisted at an unnatural angle, his face contorted in pain. But he was alive. They had escaped the clutches of Cranbrook. "I think so," Liam replied, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I think we're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly safe, not really. The asylum had a way of burrowing into your mind, of leaving its mark on your soul, and some stains he feared never truly faded. Section 4. The Weight of Darkness. They didn't speak as they limped away from the asylum, their footsteps echoing on the deserted lane. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern sky with hues of pink and orange, but the light seemed hesitant to penetrate the darkness that clung to them, a darkness that emanated not from the woods around them, but from within their own hearts. The journey back to the car was a blur. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent shivers down their spines, their minds conjuring up images of the shadowy figure, the echoing laughter, the whispers that still seemed to linger at the edge of their awareness. When they finally reached the car, its familiar form a beacon of safety in the encroaching dawn, they collapsed onto the dew-covered grass, their bodies racked with tremors they could no longer suppress. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with shared trauma that bound them together in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The sun rose higher, painting the sky in vibrant hues of gold and crimson, but the warmth of the new day did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within their bones. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. And in that exchange, something had shifted within them. Something fundamental and irrevocable. Section 5. Scars of Terror. They drove back in silence, the events of the night etched into their minds like scars on their souls. Liam, his hands still trembling on the steering wheel, glanced at his friends in the rearview mirror. Emily sat huddled in a corner, her eyes closed, her face pale and drawn. Sarah stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the rapidly disappearing tree line, her expression unreadable. They had faced their fears, and they had survived, but at what cost? The carefree innocence of youth, once a vibrant flame within them, now flickered precariously, threatened by the cold wind of their shared experience. Liam knew that things would never be the same. The asylum had a way of claiming a part of you, of leaving its mark on your soul. They might have escaped its physical clutches, but the psychological scars would take much longer to heal, if they ever truly did. He thought of Chris, his ankle broken, his face etched with pain and a terror that ran deeper than any physical wound. He thought of Emily, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a haunted silence. And he thought of Sarah, her gaze lost in the distance, as if she could still see the shadows lurking just beyond the veil of reality. T-Day. Section 6. The asylum's echo, The car bumped along the road, carrying them away from Cranbrook and towards a future that seemed irrevocably altered. As they drove, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen followed in their wake. He glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the shadowy figure materializing in the road behind them, its glowing eyes fixed on them with chilling intensity. But there was nothing there, only the empty road stretching out behind them, and the faint echo of the asylum's darkness lingering in the air, a constant reminder of the horrors they had witnessed and the secrets that remained buried within its crumbling walls. They had escaped Cranbrook, but Cranbrook had not finished with them. Its echoes would follow them, whispering in the shadows, haunting their dreams, a constant reminder of the fragility of their sanity, of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their everyday lives. For some wounds run too deep to heal, some terrors too profound to forget, and the echoes of the abandoned asylum would continue to reverberate through their lives, a chilling testament to the night they had dared to venture into the heart of darkness.